Welcome to the fourth meeting of HYPIA Research, and today the discussion will be about synesthesia and language, led by Dr. Usman, our president. So, Dr. Usman, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carlos. Today's meeting is a little bit special because we're constraining it for time based on the requirements that Dr. Carlos needs to be gone. So we'll constrain my presentation to 10 minutes, and we'll also keep the debate slightly shorter, to within an hour. Now, today's topic is a fascinating one. It's also a personal one for me, which is language and synesthesia. Synesthesia is defined in various ways. That's one thing that the three readings that I offered suggest. There are many different types of cross-sensory perceptive and felt sentiments that emerge from this. For example, you can have seeing text and also seeing color, the grapheme one. You can also hear a sound and feel a taste in your mouth, the lexical gustatory. And another one is from hearing music, sounds, like actual noise, and then having colors emerge. These are three of the major ones that I have personally. And the question is, do these help in any way with learning languages? So in our readings, that by Watson al., which is Synesthesia Learning, a critical review and novel theory, covers this. So does the Learning Memory and Synesthesia by Whithoft and Vinover. And finally, the other reading that I thought was very interesting was the summary by the Edinburgh University, Julia Simner. So what's the difference between the three? If you take the three readings, the Simner is the opening background, looks at the literature over a long period of time. This is actually an old problem in the literature. It's been there since 1800s. And earliest mentions go back to the 1600s, but we're not sure if it was actually synesthesia or just a metaphor. And since then, it was not in vogue, but it's back in vogue since the last 30 years. And what we're talking about in the literature is questions about, is this something that is learned? Can it be learned over a long period of time? Meaning, even as an adult, could you have somebody trained? That is in the work of Vinover and Whithoft. And then, is it because you learned these letters as colors that you see these specific colors? And that they looked at what were Fisher-Price toys like in the United States when they were lost, and they saw that its commonality with the colors that they see was pretty much the toy that they had as a kid. And finally, there's a critical appraisal by Watson. And what it does is, are there false positives with people? So are people saying it, or do they genuinely feel it? Do they misunderstand when you mention? People get very excited by this topic. So are people just getting excited, or do they really have it? There are different estimates that come from the literature about what percentage of people have it, but like a 3 to 5 sounds reasonable. For many people, they don't realize that it's something unusual, that most people don't have it. I see a parallel in this where you could have, for example, a voice in your head talking to yourself. About half the population has a voice in their head that talks to them. So what happens when a person that does have this voice and doesn't have this voice is the person who has this voice says, you don't have a voice in your head, and the other one says, wait, you do have a voice in your head? And it's funny like that. So I do have a voice in my head. I talk to myself a lot. And synesthesia is similar. It's like, I didn't know that not everybody saw colors evoke in the mind when you read. In my personal experience, I've known it since I was about 4 years old. So when I look at text, I do see colors, and it's not seeing the colors on the text, like the text is black on a white paper, obviously, but it's like a firework goes off in every little letter, like an outline around that word is in that color. One thing that the literature points out that's interesting is that certain colors seem to be universal. Like A is red. This is like a very strong one. I test it, yeah, A is red for me too. But if A is red, it doesn't mean alif in the Perso-Arabic script is red. It's actually white for me. In the second reading that we have, Whithoft and Vinover, the Fisher-Price exhibit that's given at the end, page 5, I actually don't see the same numbers they do. I did have the same toy, so I'm not quite convinced by their hypothesis. For example, their B is orange, but mine's actually yellow. Their C is yellow, but mine's blue. So I did have the same toy. So I'm not entirely persuaded that's a one-for-one thing. The funny thing is how it changes based on a script. One hypothesis is that B and D, for example, since they're similarly shaped, would have a similar color. So for me, it's yellow for B and white for D. It's not that far apart, but I see it change entirely in a different script. So in Urdu, which uses Nastaliq, the Perso-Arabic form of script, you have the B, which is be, it's blue for me. But you add another dot, it's ye, which is yellow for me. So that it actually changes in my mind as I see it. And if you add 3 dots, it's be, which is like a velvet, purple kind of color. Similarly, you have a dot above the curve, it's noon, which is red for me. But you add 2 dots, it becomes bright pink for me, be. And you add 3, that's a the, like the theta, and that's a dark purple for me. So just by adding dots, suddenly the colors change. That's very interesting. The question is, does this expand to other scripts? So what the third reading that we have, which is Watson, said that it helps, and Simner also said this, that if you have a slightly similar script, like let's say Cyrillic and Latin, a character that might look like one from the other, like a backwards R, which is a ya in Russian, probably has the same color. It's actually true that so I do read Cyrillic script, and it is true that I do see it as a Greek. But here's something interesting. In the reading by Whithoft and Vinover, there in the Fisher-Price toy, the P is green, but for me, P is orange. Now here's what happens with the Russian. So I'm linking to the previous point. With Russian, the P-looking character is actually Ro, it's a R. So I would screw it up unless I tell my mind it's Cyrillic, and then I see this character in green, and then I'm like, R. If I see it as P, I'll make the mistake, because P is like a pi in Greek in the Cyrillic script. So it actually can lead to some confusion, which if you deliberately do, then it makes sense. Later in life, which is the hypothesis of adult learning, by Watson et al., I don't believe that it's possible. So, for example, in my case, it isn't, because for hiragana, katakana, I don't see colors, or I see a kind of mishmash, and it doesn't really stay. So I think it's kind of whimsical, like my brain is trying to make associations, but it's not working out. So I don't see katakana or hiragana with specific colors because I learned these in like mid-20s. So, and as for Chinese characters, I don't see it at all, or it's a kind of mishmash, and it doesn't make sense. I certainly don't associate it with the sounds. That's because ideograms are different depending on whatever dialect you speak, right? And also that in Japanese, ideograms, some of them are shared with the traditional Chinese. So tian, ten, right? So, but I would actually see it written out in a Latin syllabary. That's the problem. Now, if I work on other languages with different scripts, I'm sure that I would either see a mishmash, but it's not a consistent learning as having seen it as a child, like up to age 10. So I learned the Urdu script at age 6. The childhood learning is a big part of this literature. That's why I'm sharing that. But knowing this, is it good or bad? There's a suggestion that Synesthesia and Learning, a critical review, so Watson et al., say that it's probably advantageous, and so does Simner, alludes to the point that it's advantageous. For me, it does help in certain things. For example, with reading, I do see a symmetry or a kind of panoply of colors, and it helps because what the argument of the literature, and I share this observation, is that it's kind of a mnemonic device. So somebody who's not synesthetic may have to invent a mnemonic, but as far as learning goes, I have that mnemonic naturally, and for some things, so pattern recognition happens more easily. But perhaps the question is, maybe I'm not learning as much as I used to. Like I'm not learning as many new things at this age as I did when I was 10, right? So maybe it just, the brain doesn't use as much mnemonic, doesn't need to draw on a mnemonic faculty to the same extent. But for example, one field where it has helped me more than language acquisition is music. So playing instruments, I do have the auditory synesthesia. And the way it works is I see a set of colors. And that helps me to play much more consistently and keep a much better pitch also. With, for example, sitar, you bend slightly and you get microtones. Microtones I can balance much more. But it's not the symmetry of notes. So in a piano, for example, in an octave, you have 8 notes from the first to the, and so you'll say, I'm going to the third. But for me, it's actually by the first instrument I learned properly, which was guitar. And so I'm not looking at the third, because third is the number 3, which is green for me. No, I'm looking at the gap between that original note and the next one, which would be 4 frets, because there's flats or sharps. And so 12 notes in an octave. And I'd actually look at that 4 frets apart and see the number 4. So and 4 is brown. So I don't see green for third, I see brown. That scale is actually more organic and consistent. It's not something taught to you like it's a fifth or something. And so what happens is, even in the original teaching of what's Pakistani classical music, the word is raga or rag. And rag actually is etymologically cognate with rang, which is the word for color. So even the architects of such a tradition saw color as the archetype. So music is one where it's helped me much more. And probably the most irritating one is the lexical gustatory one. So there's certain words that came into my mind and they make me think of a taste, which I don't like. So for example, the word Balto, I don't know if you ever saw this cartoon from, I don't know, the 70s or something, where it's a dog and it does something, and his name was Balto. And whenever I heard that word, it made me taste like chicken. It's so weird, and it's very irritating because there's no point of me hearing the word Balto and having a stupid taste in my mouth. I actually hate that word. And luckily we don't use it much. But so out of the 3, reading has been a very useful one, and the literature suggests that it's a mnemonic device and it helps with it. I don't know why people would pretend to do this, because even if I didn't have it, I'm sure I'd be able to learn languages. It's just that it helps, but it also can confound you. As I mentioned with the Russian one, you'd have to actively change it. So it's kind of neutral. With music, it's a huge help. And with taste, it's kind of useless. But why do we have this is the final part of the literature that was interesting. They say that it may be a cross-firing of different parts of the brain. This is more strongly seen in Watson's review, Watson et al.'s review. And here in the mind, the 2 zones and the cross-firing. So neurons fire all across the brain all the time. So you may see something and recall something. And our brains just work in that way. And it's very interesting that there's so many neurons firing. I mean, there's so many of them. And the cross-firing is just stronger between 2 zones. It's a similar analogy to our best understanding, which is actually a 40-year-old understanding now, a fetish. So you have 2 different parts that fire. And so you get arousal from seeing something that may not to a typical person be arousing. It's the same sort of thing.
1 minute, please.
Oh, okay. So cross-firing in the neurons is probably the reason why we have it. Is it interesting? Yes, I figured as a child that most people have it. I have it, and in terms of languages, it helps, but it also hinders. But it's certainly part of the color of life. So it actually makes life enriching in that sense. But you shouldn't feel weird or bad if you don't have it, like feel left out. Synesthesia is just something that happens. If you're a musician, I can see the advantages of it. If you are a scholar, maybe or maybe not. And if you're like into being a chef or something, it's probably bad for you. But it's part of the spice of life, let's put it that way. So based on these readings, I do encourage you to go into it. I do plan to write a paper on this. I do want to find out how many of our fellow hyperpolyglots in this research group and in the HYPIA community more broadly have it. Maybe there's a connection. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Usman. It was very enlightening, and you threw many questions, as we said in the instructions. You suggested 4 or 5 questions that people can touch up on that are certainly very interesting. And Victor had raised his hand, so we'll begin with Victor and we'll take it from there. Victor? We can't hear you.
I will start by quoting the movie serial. Alles ist miteinander verbunden. Everything is connected to everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to share an experience because I'm 56 years old. I had never felt a synesthetic experience.
Mm-hmm.
But since about, let's say 8 months, 9 months, I've been kind of experienced this stuff because I think I have a training about that, a self-training about that. Let me explain you. I'm starting my language enterprise, and I have a team who helps me in marketing, and I write in many languages, but they don't know the languages, so I decided to color code the texts I send them to publish. And then I say, red is for English, green is for Brazil, because it's green, and yellow is for our communication, and violet is for other languages, and so on. Okay, that's something. Then I start, as you know, learning Slavic languages. And what do? I have a Mac computer. I have a computer with white letters and black, written in black. I want to use this keyboard with every language. So what I do is I put stickers in my keyboard, red stickers for Belarusian, blue stickers for Ukrainian, etc. Then I start learning the 4 languages, and then I start to write my diary, my learning diary, and I do quote my diary in colors. I start speaking, writing in Russian, red, then Ukrainian, blue, etc. That's the thing. And now I'm starting to feel language colors. So when the question was raised about synesthesia and learning, language learning, I think I have a fabricated case of color synesthesia, and I found the three articles very interesting because they think about color, language learning, and today morning I found another article about neuroimaging literature. I will send it to the group, and it's something they believe that if there is a connection, synesthesia would be located in parietal brain or in frontal brain, which is exactly what I would think about that. So I don't know if through MMR you can distinguish between, say, learned synesthesia or inborn synesthesia. I don't know if that can be distinguished. I do believe it helps me a lot to think languages in color. It's fascinating.
All right, Victor, thank you very much. Yeah, I think as Usman said, can it be learned? That's a very important question. And another question is, why would it be learned if it can, right? And as Usman said, there are memory advantages to learning it, but there are also disadvantages. So it's not clear that all be positive if learned. We have 2 people raising their hands. First, Anja, and then Professor Guillen. Anja?
Hello. So my question is actually to the Usman. You said you had synesthesia since you were 4 years old. How do you experience synesthesia? Like, you feel it as advantage or not? You mentioned that it helped, especially with playing music, but I read in some of the articles that some women that wanted to learn piano, actually synesthesia caused her a lot of struggle because she saw 3 colors for her fingers, for pitch, and also for the tones of for the piano. I don't know if also playing with both hands, that was confusing, but you would say synesthesia was for you something that give you an advantage or not? And how do you use it when it's as an advantage? Thank you.
Thank you, Anya. So the piano example is very interesting in the paper that you mentioned, because it seemed so disorienting from the fundamentals that she couldn't do it, the subject. I had this problem with scientific literature, because the way that words are in scientific literature, for example, they're not structured with any harmony in the way an organic language is. So memorizing like long words, so for example, the medical terminology or something, actually kind of disorienting. So, and one set of words that is very bad at this is economics literature. So studying economics as a teenager, for example, and I am an economist, it was actually extremely distorting. For example, supply curves, demand curves, or long-term supply curves, and all these terms, it was very bad for that, because it's kind of like this woman playing the piano, where I just had to kind of shut it down. I can kind of, like, the colors are there, but you can suppress the feeling you have of colors in the brain. I have to insist that with this sort of synesthesia where you read stuff, it's not that you're seeing color with your eyes. Your eyes know that the text is black, but it's like fireworks are growing in your brain. The more colors you are observing on the text, so the longer the word, the more colors there are. But it's like fireworks in the brain. So that's like economics is very bad for this, in my personal experience. With music, I don't play the piano, so maybe I would feel the same thing. But for example, the stringed instruments, they have a consistent logic, right? The mechanism is the same in all stringed instruments. So guitar, bass, double bass, and sitar, it's consistent and it's beautiful. And I don't make mistakes. In fact, I explore different variants of a color scheme, like a painting. Like impressionist painting is the best analogy to rags. And each one has a different setting and mood. And it really helps with that.
Thank you for that informative answer, Dr. Usman. Now we have Professor Guillen and then Tim.
Yeah, can you see me? I think.
Yes, yes, we can.
Yeah, you can see me. Okay, because I do not see myself. My question to Usman is about the states, the emotional states when seeing the colors. You said that you can suppress the colors sometimes when they are distracting. And I would like to ask you, have you ever observed a change in your perceptions of these colors when you are in different emotional states? And the second question, also connected with this, is do you think that your color perceptions are changing or they changed along the years? They categorized somehow, or they became more fixed associations? Because you already also said that they are very distracting when you are seeing them in different languages. So please try to reflect upon these two things. I think it will also be useful for your article. Thank you so much.
Usman, do you want to reply to that before we switch to Tim?
Yes, thank you, Professor Gaya. I think it's very interesting. Both of your questions actually get subsumed into the idea of a mood. How do you feel about it? And yes, there are moods that are evoked, but it doesn't mean my temperament changes that much when I feel them. So for example, a scale in music that you would consider like something in the minor key, for example, minor keys seem sadder and major keys seem happier. The colors are consistent with that. And my color scheme, as was alluded to in two papers, is that bright is happy and dull is somber, is kind of sad. I do feel that, but it doesn't mean I start feeling sad. Not necessarily. But because I also appreciate melancholy as an aesthetic. So a scale that I do prefer things in the minor key. And so I do prefer that aesthetic, but it doesn't mean I'll feel sad. In terms of the moods as they have been consistent over time. So if you asked a 4-year-old me, is the P orange? It's still orange. So we have the same spectrum in our mind, or the same schema of numbers, colors, days, days of the week, for example, and letters. It's the same, it's consistent, it hasn't changed. There are tests online, by the way, so everybody can check them out. And if you find that you have a high score on that, you probably are a synesthete. Some people actually seem to be borderline, and I don't know why. And it was raised in one of the papers as well, that can you lose it over time, or does it drift over time? For me, it hasn't. The 4-year-old me has the same color scheme, text, days of the week, etc. It's all the same.
All right.
Yeah. May I continue about this?
Just very briefly, because we have 3 people that want to participate and we are running on a very tight schedule. So if it's a long question, we should say before the end. If it's a short question, you can go ahead.
No, it's not a question. I just wanted to share share my own perceptions because I have also had some kind of experiences, but it was not colors, it was speech, it was meanings. Something was said to me, but there was no grammar because I'm a linguist. So when I heard the message, information, I was in a very emotional state and I heard some kind of information. Somebody told something to me. It was in my head, as you are saying, it was a bright flashlight in my head. And then I tried to decipher the grammar and trying to understand in what language they were speaking to me. I could not, but there was the plural and the present tense, but there was no language form. So it's a question for me I cannot understand. That's why this synesthesia as a phenomenon is interesting for me. I'm far from being a mystical person, but yeah, actually there are things that we still do not understand. Thank you.
Thank you. And Tim, do you want to touch up on this or any other topic?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I'd like to come back to Usman, if I may, about your comment about the difficulty of reading scientific and economic texts. As a scientist, I write a lot of articles. So I'm curious, if somebody was to write an article for you, how would you like it to be structured?
It's a very interesting question because there is a general, scientific writing is shaped by norms and by the scientific community. So I would expect them to write as they expect themselves to write. I do read a lot of scientific literature. So for example, a crossover of economics and public health epidemiology is COVID. And I've read so much since then. And in fact, my fourth book is on public value and pandemics. And it's unpleasant in a sense, and I do suppress it, but I wouldn't want, there's no normative sense where I'd want the scientific community to change its norms for my delight. And you simply can't do that. But I think it's a fascinating question. Thank you.
Right. I mean, the reason I also mention it is when we, are told to modify our teaching materials, for instance, for students with disabilities, and yeah, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying in any way that your condition is a disability, but generally such changes for people with difficulties tend to be good for the student population as a whole, I think. So this is what makes me curious. Maybe if we were to write more for people with certain conditions, we might actually be able to improve the general readability of scientific literature. Just a thought that came to me.
Fascinating thought. Yes, thank you.
All right, great. Thank you, Tim and Usman. And now Deborah and then Matthias.
I was just interested in the genetic aspects of it because some of the readings suggested that that there is a kind of family tendency. So have you personally, Usman, have you found that there are other members of your family that also have this? And if they do, is it very similar to yours or different?
Thank you, Deborah. Yes, it was mentioned in the papers that in fact, that there may be a genetic component. It's strongly in the critical review mentioned. I talked to my father this afternoon. He doesn't have it. He was actually fascinated by it. He doesn't have it. And he didn't know that I had it, even though I probably mentioned it a few times as a kid. My mother and my brother, I have yet to ask. So if it is genetic, if there is a genetic component, well, those two, my mother and brother, are HYPIA members. So it would be interesting in that context too. And I probably do get it from her if I do get it from her, if there is a genetic component. But my father doesn't have it, for example.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question and for the answer. Matthias, what's next?
I will be very brief, Carlos.
Mm-hmm.
Despite its physiological nature, synesthesia as a phenomenon is one more of the multiple ways of creating relations between entities. I mean, creating associations within objects. And that's it's part of our natural mnemonic process. Being synesthetic or not, us as human beings, we do permanently as we associate permanently nouns or objects with several kinds of relation between. In that sense, when you scale up to the nth power all of our capacity to create associations between nouns, welcome to hyperpolyglots. It's as simple as this. It's just a way, synesthesia is just a way to create associations between things, despite not being from the same family.
Shall I respond, Carl?
Yeah, sure.
Matthias makes a good point that all people associate different things. And this speaks to what Professor Gayan was also saying with her experience. Association is what the mind does. But the thing with synesthesia is that it's involuntary, it's very powerful, and it evokes all the time, and you actually have to suppress it. So I think if people could do it, they would choose to do it just for the fun of it. But the fact that this association is remarked upon so much, despite what Matthias is pointing out correctly, is that it's involuntary and it evokes naturally as a child, and it's actually very powerful. So that's why it's different. So,
okay, and thank you for the answer. And I think it was a great comment, Matthias. Victor raised his hand, but Johannes hasn't participated yet, so I'll go to Johannes and then to you, Victor, if you don't mind.
Just very quickly, I was wondering, because you said about Dr. Usman, about seeing colors with letters. And for learning a language, I thought that, seeing something with a word, except for a pattern like that is made up of singular letters, would be something interesting. Do you experience something like this? Because from my experience, I only remember when I hear herring, I can see color red just because I had a big red herring in my wardrobe when I learned English, and to remember the phrase red herring, it was in red, and that's the only connection I could build like this with a word or something like this. And I was wondering, can you, maybe from experience, do you see it, or maybe it is possible to build, in your opinion, so that we could help others learn word vocabulary?
are you suggesting that we use a certain color for a word as a whole? Is that it?
Yes, so you hear, I know, herring, let's say, and you, I don't know, see a color, hear a color, because for me this is totally abstract. I can read about it, but I've never felt anything similar. I tried to build such connections, but never had. So
yes, I understand your point. It would make sense, but it requires something very important. It requires that you perceive that many different colors to have that much of a spectrum of words, because you may know in your mother tongue about 40,000 words, but can you really perceive 40,000 colors? Yes, in theory, but it's quite a struggle, and the crossover of words would need to follow some structure so that the words that are closer together also are with colors that are closer together. So, for example, when I think of blue or see the word blue, I do think of blue as a color, but the word blue has different letters. So the E in blue is green, for example. So I can see the word and understand its abstraction, but seeing the word has different colors in it. Pink is P is orange, I is white, N is red, and K is black, but I suppress that to see the idea of pink. And so the mind can juggle between the word and the letters, you think?
thanks.
All right, great. And before I go to Victor, I just wanted to ask a question of my own, if you don't mind. Very brief question. I think most of us touched up on this briefly, but we didn't make that question explicit. And my question is, how is synesthesia interpreted in society in terms of being a condition? Or somebody said in this conversation, I think it was Tim, he said, okay, I wouldn't call it a disability. And even though it might be negative in some scenarios, just like it is mnemonic in some others. So is this interpreted as a condition, as a superpower, as a mysterious phenomenon that is attractive for people, as in sort of voyeurism phenomenon? Because I think the answer to that question will determine whether people would like to be synesthetic, would like to have, and hence the phenomenon of all false positives. People that claim to be synesthetic, even though they're not really sure, or there's like very slim evidence. What do you think?
I think this is a very deep question, and you've kind of brought together different people's questions here. And it's an important one. So the society, in my experience, treats it as a quirk, and quirks are funky. It's interesting, but you have to look at the thread in society and where it veers to see how it's changing, and why the research interest has come again in the past 30 years. Past 30 years coincide with postmodernism. And postmodernism asks you to follow your heart and be individualistic, and there are no truths in it. I think that's a very important substructure or superstructure, because the quirkier you're expected to be, the more hip you are. The irony being that all hipsters look exactly the same, although they're doing a mishmash, but you cannot distinguish one hipster from the other. So the more quirks and individualism as a whole is prioritized or given a premium, the more people would want to do this. But for example, in a more traditional society, so I live in a society where it's on the cultural map, the most collectivist society in the world, more than China or Japan, Pakistan. And here people would respond like, oh, really? Huh. And that's it, because it's a quirk. But individualism wants you to push it out, and you will see many type 2 errors because of that. That's a fascinating question. That's my reading of it.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. So there might be a cultural incentive in postmodernism. Sorry, Victor, I don't mean you to keep you up for longer. What is your question? Victor? Victor, is he?
Oh, yeah, no problem. I think society thinks of synesthesia as crazy, to be sure. A different thread, and I think this is perhaps linked to the phenomenon that many people must experience synesthesia and be shy of that, and be shy about that, and don't declare it to other people. But I was giving food to thought. 7 colors, 7 musical notes. It's easy to associate. Another thing, daltonism or colorblindness is mainly genetical. Many behavioral aspects of life are now known to be at least family associated, inherited perhaps. Then, as I said, language is associative. Everything connects to everything. And to me now, it's a linguistic, an aid to learning, because I start to think of red as English and Russian, which is the language, the colors I'm using in the video and in the keyboard. Say blue is Ukrainian. So it comes to think of another associative mechanism. I don't believe it's inborn in me, but I think that's another example of the common association of nature versus nurture. I'll say, is it inborn? Is it trained? Very difficult to determine.
Mm-hmm.
How much associative behavior is inherited? How much language learning is inherited or trained?
Mm-hmm.
That seems to point that language learning is not so much inborn as trained. I believe that comes to associative behavior too, and perhaps synesthesia can be trained and can be integrated into a learning strategy.
Mm-hmm. All right, it certainly can. It certainly can, Victor. And that's an interesting observation. Anja and then Professor Guillen. Anja?
Okay, so maybe going back to the languages and somehow also in connection with Victor's suggestion, I was actually want to ask you guys, actually, how do you learn languages? Because for certain languages, I also used different senses. So maybe for a language that was very far away from the languages I knew before, like Chinese, I used the certain candle, the smell. So I was listening to the music in the background. That was something Chinese, but at the same time, I was listening, hearing, and seeing the the characters and also the Latinic version of the of the characters. So theoretically, all my senses were 100% there when I was learning a new language. And maybe not just about totally new language. Also with learning a language from the same language group, I can focus 100% and then 2 sentences I can understand from a new language that is, from the same language group that you already speak one language. But then my concentration get lost and I lose 1 sentence or 2. And then I can concentrate again and I understand again. So what are the different techniques? How do you use different senses to remember better, to understand languages? Is this also some kind of synesthesia or just how we know how to use different senses in our advantage? Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Anja. Does anybody want to answer directly to this question before we proceed with Professor Gayen's comment?
I have some experience to share.
Go ahead.
This week I tried a new keyboard because I'm doing a keyboard for Windows, and it gave me a big headache, and I didn't know why. And then I started to have a look at the keyboards. The keyboard I use normally has the Latin characters on the right and the Russian Cyrillic characters on the left. The new keyboard does the reverse, so I had to reverse special perception of the keyboards and the Cyrillic versus Latin characters. It gave me a big headache, and I had to abandon the keyboard.
So that's how not to learn.
Special association. And color association, it's synesthesia again.
Right. Okay, Professor Guillen?
Well, next time I will write only my name because it's too formal saying all the time, Professor. I just thought that I have to introduce this. Talking about synesthesia, whether it is inborn, let me turn on the camera, I'm sorry. I forgot about it. Can you see me now?
Yes.
Talking about the origins of synesthesia, whether it is inborn or acquired, I just want to remember the words of one philosopher who said that any exception in humans is either the remnant of an ancient feature, skill, or law, or regularity, or it's the first swallows, as they call it, from a new feature, new development of evolution. So looking at synesthesia, we can find in languages the traces of it. Not speaking even about metaphors, I just want to bring the example of the 24 names of the 24 hours of the day that we have in Armenian, and I think there is also this kind of a system in Spanish. I remember when I was studying the category of time, I came across this information. So if the people in ancient times could identify the 24 shades of light and give a name to each of them instead of putting numbers like 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. Instead of that, they had separate words for each different shade of the day, light day, and even the night hours. Then we can assume that synesthesia existed in ancient times, and we can find the reflection of this phenomenon in different languages and cultures. because this discussion seems very interesting to me, so I wonder if we could put together all the ideas we have about it into an article and publish it somewhere. Carlos, this question is for you. Or maybe this is not a question, just an idea to ponder over later. Thank you. I promise not to talk anymore.
No, certainly you can. You're welcome and invited, encouraged to talk more until the time runs up. One of the purposes of this, in peer-reviewed journals or based on our discussion. So it's something we need to consider, and as Dr. Usman said, he's going to be working on a related journal article, so we can take it from there, I guess. Matthias wanted to participate.
So very briefly, so are you suggesting, for example, that the 8 different names of the winds in cardinal and ordinal winds, Tramuntana, Carlich, Llevant, Midjourn, etc., Llevant, okay, all the 8 main winds in Catalan, French, and Italian, etc., are a product of somebody who had synesthesia instead of used simply north, northeast, east, southwest, west.
Is this a question for Professor Guillen?
Matthias, if you're asking that question to me, so I have to say that I'm not suggesting anything. I just brought the fact. In Spanish and in Armenian, there are words for every hour of the 24 hours of the day. And these words are descriptive. They are describing the shade of light at that moment. I will send you the information. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just saying that in older times, people could rationalize their perceptions and put them into words. Not all of them. Perhaps it's very cultural, I think. It's very culturally dependent. But that's a version that we can try and test and see if it works.
May I?
It's very interesting, eh? Schnurhagalem.
Okay. Usman?
I think Guyan has brought up a very interesting point about the past and the future. Either it was something we needed in the past, or it's something going forward. It might be something recent in the past. So, for example, if I say that music, the rags in the Pakistan system are there, well, that probably goes back at least 3,000 years. So yes, it may be from the past. The written word, though, is also maybe 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 max, writing as we understand it. And so, yes, it might help. But insofar as it's something that we've developed somewhat recently in our human physiognomy or neuropsychology, then yes, it might be something cool, because as we came up with these new devices for recording or lived experiences, well, then maybe we were working on how do we do it, and it might help. So as far as the music one, I'm certainly convinced of it. As far as the written word, it might be a forward-looking thing that as we evolved it, well, we just had crossfiring and it might be something useful. It's something to look into. I agree.
Gayan, what the philosopher is from that one. Do you remember the source of that?
I remember it from my entrance examination when I was 17 years old and I was entering the university. The rector of the university came to listen to my exam, and because I was answering the grammatical questions with examples from different humors, so they were laughing, they could not help. And then the rector, he was a philosopher, and he asked me this question. I was 17 years old then, and he told me, well, you were talking about exceptions in the language. I was speaking about the declension of the Armenian language, and by accident, I did not understand it before, but when I said it out loud, I understood that my examples were all some kind of sexual related, and they started laughing loudly. And so he said, so you are speaking about the exceptions. What do you think? How do they appear? And in my 17 years old brain, I just elicited somehow this answer. I said, oh, that must come from old times, something that is left just single examples, or it is the first sign of something that is beginning to evolve in humankind. So it turns out that I'm that philosopher, but I don't think so. I think that there were people who said it before me. Simply, it was my logical elicitation, which was accepted during that exam day. I remember that example because we come across many exceptions, and we're trying to find the explanation. So logically, quite logically, we can find it either in the past, or we can see some prospects in the future and see where it takes us. Because if we look into the future, we can see that it's a form of categorization when we are using our multimodal perception to categorize, to conceptualize, to understand our perceptions, right? So perhaps in the future, this kind of multimodal perception can help human beings overcome their difficulties in speech, language learning, and maybe also the different languages, because we know there are universals. The notes, the music notes, the rainbow colors. So there are archetypical universals, which may lead us to something unique, something singular. It's just a hypothesis.
Great.
I think all of us will have this kind of ideas.
Sure. I apologize because I lost a connection for a couple of minutes, but I still got the answer. The philosopher was you. Thank you. And now I just want to say that we have a couple more minutes and then we have to wrap this up due to time constraints.
One last point then, because you do have to get going.
Yes, sure.
There's an interesting point that we mentioned about the universality of colors, but keep in mind that most languages do not have a separate word for green and blue. The idea of 7 colors is actually a subjective thing as well. So some languages only have 3 words for 3 colors. That's it. Ours is 7, and the same is true for musical notes. So we have an octave, and there's 12 notes in that. But there's a lot of the use of microtones, particularly in Oriental musical systems. So how we draw the boundaries there matters too. And it's what Jan mentioned about having a word for each color and so on. Yes, in theory, you could have 40,000 different perceived colors because you have 40,000 words. But how much of that is useful and how much of that would just be so overwhelming? That's the question. And how much is subjective in that? So I do perceive colors, but in that, but it's quite a big shade. So sometimes it's a light orange or a dark orange for P. I don't know, that kind of thing. So the gradients in what we perceive can be quite vast.
Yeah, I agree with you. I absolutely agree.